Thank you, Mr. Airplane.
Kitty! Thanks for coming along, everybody. Here we are in Stockholm. We're going to take a trip around a neighborhood of the city called Kungsholmen. It is that big island in the upper left corner there, and its founding goes back to the founding of the city around the 1500s. It's changed a lot, obviously, in the 16, 17, 18, 19, and 2000s. So lots of those hundreds in there. This is a map from 1773, and we'll be comparing what was going on today and throughout that time, using that from time to time. Many folks are familiar here with the main city hall. In fact, most tours go by there, and most tourists just stop by and say hi. They probably don't know that right across the street is a feudal farm that was founded in the 1600s. And just up the street from that is a really interesting industrial site from the genius industries of the 17 and 1800s, things like steam turbines. Around the corner from that, where those big round buildings are, started out as a working farm for a recently raised nobility family with a mill and so forth. And stretching all the way across the other side is the boundary of the Hornsberg farm at the time. Now covered over, as you will quickly see, a bunch of industrial and residential buildings, shopping districts, and so forth. But right in the heart of that, in those long rectangles, is where the castle actually originally stood. And that is now, today, a brewery that was taken over by a pharmaceutical company. We'll go see those things shortly. Literally across the street is the Kristineberg estate. It's very much a public use site with lots of as you can see, park facilities, a track, and the main palace buildings are now a school. So we'll go see those places as well. Across from there is a famous house, a summer villa of a famous newspaperman from the 1850s. Down the way, we get back more into the industrial. So where that soccer field is was originally an ammunitions factory and is today the Russian embassy. Down along the peninsula was a series of islands and was filled in and became a very much a pleasure palace kind of place and burned down. And across its way is a famous farm built on top of a medieval brickworks. Around the corner from there, a big park and a palatial building that is in fact Stockholm's first mental hospital. And from there, we will go back towards the center of the island and continue exploring the sort of mishmash of industrial stuff in that big park area. Originally, there was a mill on the center, that big X right under the L in the word Holmen, and it supplied a lot of wheat and grind to brandy industries and, of course, food and baking. This area here is now a bunch of government buildings, the police and judicial departments, for example, but built on top of a 1600s feudal farm. And we'll go see what actually still remains there, part of the garden. Getting right back down to the tip of the island is Kungsholmen Church. It's famous for being existing since 1688. And as you can see, the dome and other things have been much the same since 1773. So we'll go take a look at that. Here, while the buildings themselves have not changed very much, in fact, the landscape around them has. The big eye-looking building was the Royal Mint, and as it spins under us here, the rest was the Glassworks area, and it was in fact on its own island. And then we'll wrap up right here on the Grubbensparken estate. And as you'll see, we'll go and see all these places all the way down on the ground. See you there.
Hello, thanks for stopping by and joining us today for this little trip of Kungsholmen. Big old neighborhood in Stockholm, and we're starting out right across the street from the famous town hall. It's about 100 years old, and where the Nobel laureates get their meals when they are awarded the prize. Of course, it's awarded across over there. Having said that, this nondescript parking lot that you're looking at actually has a 400-year plus history, and that's what we're here for. It's in the signs. We're going to explore some areas around Kungsholmen today and show you things you may not have understood. What exactly this parking lot is like, I'm going to ask you to come along, well, a little bit of a long journey, and we'll come back to it. Just know we're going to span from basically the 1600s through the 21st century today. I'm going to start with this little bridge over here, where you see today a stone arch. Originally, it was one of the longest floating bridges in the world. And what I'm standing on now is a lot of landfill. So it was filled in for the town hall, as I said, about 100 years or so ago. And that'll be a recurring theme. Where is the shoreline? Where was the shoreline? What were people doing there? And what they were doing here about 400 years ago was connecting with the neighborhood across there, Norrmalm, and in the distance, where the pink church tower is Gamlestan, the old town. That's where the royal palace is. And Kungsholmen here was another outer neighborhood where many feudal farms were granted, and the whole island then grew up around them. And this part, again, near the town hall, is among the more densely populated and farmed areas, and the other half, which is now full up, was very empty. And as we'll see through a series of historical photographs and our own visits, how that growing up happened. So join me, won't you?
Here we are at the technical building, the home of the Public Works Committee, which plans much of the industrial development of the city and so forth. It was built in the 1960s and is about a kilometer, half mile down from the city hall, along the waterway of the island. At the time, it was very, very busy with waterworks of all kinds, so vessels going, loading, unloading, and so forth. And now, as you can see, it's traffic and trains. So don't let some of these park settings fool you. There is a lovely park, which I often run all the way around the island, but they are laid on top of lots of this history. So again, these buildings, 1960. Across the street is the original Separator AB building that was specializing in steam turbines and considered one of Stockholm's early quote-unquote genius industries. And what we'll be seeing as we go along on all of these sites is how one thing was built upon another, how it is transformed in time, and yet how much remains. So stick with us, won't you? Let's go down the way to the Grubben farm, right in the border area of where things began to develop in the 1700s. So here we go. So here we are on Fleminggaten, and this road has existed all the way back in time. You can see it on the 1773 map, and this is an 1868 painting that you can see the mill in the corner there, and that is Grubben's mill that was built on Grubben's farm. This site has been around, though, since about 1587, when there was a Dutch brick-making facility on the site. And so it's gone from brickmaking to farm to factory to hospital and is now a major residential area. So it was owned in the 18th century by a Mr. Grubb, or Grub. As always, you'll have to forgive my Swedish. I am still learning. And he was later raised to nobility as Grubben, and so this area is really known as the Grubben area, but also as St. Eric's for the hospital, which came along much later. So when it was a farm, things like tobacco and other kinds of things were grown here that the nobility may want to do, and they had various numbers of pleasure sites and so forth. But pretty quickly, by the 1800s or so, it started to be recognized more as a site of commerce and factory, and then it became sort of a poorhouse, if you will, a workhouse. And so by 1864, at the time of that painting, the whole area was really only known as a welfare establishment, and where they offered food and accommodations and work for all kinds of poor, otherwise unemployed, disabled, or even sick folks. So this was kind of a hub for that kind of thing within the city. But again, this was the outskirts of the city at the time. To our left on any of this, which are currently residential buildings in that round shape that we could see from the satellite image, they were hinterlands. There was just nothing between this site and where we'll go next, which is the Hornsberg site. Right ahead of us here, though, you can see some of those buildings from the 1700s. Those are what would have been factory sites at the time, where people were doing their work and getting busy with themselves, as the case may be. But before we get more into that, let's think about that mill, because it was here, and as we'll see in our tour today, they're often placed on these big high sites where you can catch the wind, of course, because they were windmills. That was the major energy source of the time. And right up there on that rock is exactly where it would be. And so there are paintings of it, as we just saw the 1868 one. This is that again. This is the site. And another one from 1892, where you could really get a good sense of exactly what has and hasn't changed since that time. But coming back into the facility here, let's take another little bit of a look at the factories and the working areas and see what we can see there. So as we do start coming back towards the center of the site here, again, those orange buildings on the right were the factory buildings. And in those late 1800s, going into the 1900s, this actually changed its name, and it was known as the Stockholm City's General Supply Facility, and or the Stockholm City Labor Facility. You got a quick picture there of what things were going on and what those factory buildings sort of were at the time, and you got a sense of the people who were working there. As we already mentioned, sort of the infirm, the sick, the poor, the unemployed. This was a public facility trying to help anyone who needed it here in the city. Pretty quickly after that, though, it was built into a hospital, and that is by about the 1890s. And one of the things I really love about Stockholm, and the whole purpose of this channel here, these featurettes, is to feature the signs, and there are some amazing ones, although some of them you really need to know what you're looking at. So here, this silly nondescript looking set of rectangles and squares in the middle of the facility is actually a map of the 1897 way that the hospital looked. And so one thing to notice is the little thing on the corner there, which I've magically moved in the satellite image, but was the chapel that was built in the 1900s, the 1913, I do believe, but then moved. And so what we're going to look at as the last thing we see here is the chapel that you can see in the middle of the round buildings. But before we do that, let's see what remains of the hospital. In short, it is that set of white low buildings in the distance there, and was in use up until like the 1970s or so, but is today not very much used, and in fact is just an eye clinic. Although the little tunnel that we used to enter is also a child's clinic, as sort of part of the same facility. And it's from the hospital's name, St. Eric's, that this area gets its current name. This area is usually called St. Eric's, which is different from St. Eric's Plan, which is a whole other neighborhood, not even on Kungsholmen. So again, you get this sense of how things have transformed over time from the 16, 17, 18, 1900s, and the amazing things that folks have done to preserve a lot of the features and heritage that does exist. And I'm always constantly impressed by that walking around. In fact, that's much of the inspiration for these featurettes. So without further ado, here is the St. Eric's Chapel, originally built in 1913 as part of the hospital area, used for funerary services, now sitting in the lovely center of this lovely residential area in a public park. And funny enough, it's called Grubbensparken, because of course we know it was built on top of Grubbens farm. Interestingly though, this is the first building that was moved as a whole, as an entire structure in Stockholm. So before that, they were building or deconstructing buildings from one place and then reconstructing them somewhere else. But this particular one, actually, as we've noted on the map, existed over there to the left, and now it exists over here to the right. So how they did that, I have not been able to find any pictures or explanations. It is known how to do those things, but it's now sitting here and you can go see it. Without further ado, though, let's go across the hinterlands, as I mentioned earlier, to the boundary of the Hornsberg site. Welcome to Mariadal. This is originally the boundary area for the Hornsberg estate. This building you're looking at was the guardhouse on the border of the estate. Across the way there is Karlsberg Palace, a royal palace that is now an army camp. But this whole area was essentially used by the working people of the original manor farm. The manor farms were granted in the 1630s with a special letter of privilege from the king on how to develop these areas and so forth. And Hornsberg was among those who received a rather large grant and developed this entire area, as we've noted, since at least the 1700s, when these things show up on maps of the entire area. So today you can see it's a very nice little park and cafe, although here in the winter it's not so much used. It's very much seasonal because no one sits out in the middle of nowhere having coffee. They do that in the city instead. But next to it is a very interesting site, which you'll see these around Stockholm as well. This one was founded in the early 1900s. They're small little garden plots that citizens can borrow and rent from the city. And you can sort of get out of the city in the city kind of idea. And as you can see, there's barbecues and orchards and gardens and so forth.
So as I was saying, these little houses are a rather large garden plot, each plotted out into smaller plots by the city, established in the early 1900s, 1909 or so, on the Ore, or district, or feudal farm of Hornsberg here at the edge. I'm really only about 100 meters from where we started a minute ago, but this little set of red buildings here is often called Little Hornsberg. And while it did have some housing and workspaces and so forth, more famously, it was known as perdition. That is to say, a place where you might lose all your money to drink. That's right, it was an alehouse, a bar, a tavern. I don't know what you might want to call it, but you can see the sign right there, Little Hornsberg. And around the corner here, we can see the Karlsberg Bridge, which again connects to the castle across the water over there. So this whole area has been here and worked since the 1600s or so. Now these little red buildings are private residences, but what I like about it is, sure, you can go to Skansen, and I hope you do. It's got a lot of really cool buildings and farms and reconstructions of all these places from around Sweden, but you'll find these sites just right around the corner if you go out for a little walk. Just keep your eyes peeled. There's a whole lot to see. It's all in the signs, and especially if you're breaking Impossible. So, nondescript street, a bunch of industrial buildings, right? Nothing to see here, but bam! Look at that. That is a brewery built in the 1800s on the site of what had been the Hornsberg Palace back in the 1600s. And so what I'm standing on is originally a feudal farm. Much of that is gone. As you can see, it's now very industrial indeed. I kind of dig that about Stockholm. It's similar to my own hometown, Seattle. We have a lot of industry, a lot of residential, and just all mixed together. And in fact, you can see this factory here is now flanked by giant apartment buildings, and while it's no longer brewing beer, it's now making pharmaceuticals. It's one of the two major breweries here that was on Kungsholmen. So we're going to go and see that in a little bit. But as we walk past here, you can see in the distance past the cars, the waterfront. Well, as we've been talking about, much of this has been filled in since then. In fact, much of the brown buildings that we're looking at are built on former coastline. So the whole waterfront has moved, I don't know, what's that, 50 meters down to the water over there. And we're going to take a little walk around these corners just to take a quick look, but also because right next door is the other major manor farm on this side of Kungsholmen. Where we started was jam-packed, as you might recall from the map that we took a look at from the 1700s. There's lots of little plots all over the place, but these two here were kind of off and on their own and doing their own thing. And while the Hornsberg one has obviously been completely overtaken, the Kristineberg, sorry, my pronunciation is terrible, is right around the corner. We're going to go see that. And it's also a beautiful mixed-use area and zone, as we'll see. See you there.
Before we get there, though, let's take a look. You can see all of the open areas there in the lower corners of the map. And here's where Hornsberg is and where we're going to Kristineberg. You can see that they're very crowded now, but let's see how very empty they used to be. This is a balloon image taken in the late 1860s, and there's Hornsberg and there's Kristineberg. In the left there is the mental hospital that we're going to visit later, but just compare how things are today with how they were back then, even just a couple hundred years ago.
Okay, what we're looking at here is the border of the Hornsberg Ore District / Fuel Farm. This big brick building is the backside of the historic brewery building we just saw, part of the pharmaceuticals. And on this side of all of that is the other manor farm, the Kristineberg farm. I think I'm saying that right. We'll check the sign in a second. In any case, you can see going full circle here, the water is down that way. This would have been all waterfront property. It's now very mixed use as we're going to walk through the entire park here. The low building on my right is a tennis and racket club. Lots of little parks and sit-out areas. A very nice skate park. Although I have to admit, I hardly ever see anyone in this one. Don't know why. A very large soccer area. And up the hill there is where the manor house is. And when we talk about mixed use, in the 1600s, this farm was all by itself. This one I'm standing on would have been corn, tobacco, wheat, whatever, lots of food crops. There was also an ornamental English garden in this area, as the nobility is wont to have. But over the intervening decades, on the one side, again, back over on that side where the Hornsberg manor farm would have been, is more and more industrial. So St. George's Hospital is up there. There's a giant shopping center, the pharmaceutical company, which we've already talked about quite a bit. But this side seems to have been used much more for residential and sports. So up on the hill here, which was also part of the farm, you'll see lots of big residential buildings behind all the trees. So interesting, those trees. And as part of that, then, all of these sports facilities. And we're going to be careful crossing the street as we walk over here. Yeah, there we go, Kristineberg. I said it right, close enough. Might be a little hard to see in the bright sun on a wonderful winter's day. But here to the left is a very nice, very modern stadium, track stadium, which we'll take a peek at as we go by. And behind it, the manor house. So this portion here was, I believe, where the English garden was. That is to say, very organized plots of flowers and bushes and trees for strolling and sitting out and enjoying oneself. And behind it then was some of the orchards and other things which we'll see. So here's the modern stadium, as I mentioned. We're not going to go in there and forgive the bars, but it's really, really nice. I like to go running there and do my Magic Mile tests and other sorts of sprinting activities. On the right here, again, another kids play area. It's frequently called the Owl Park because there's a giant owl thing little climbing structure there that kids enjoy. And it's doubly fun because the manor house here is now a school. So we'll have to be careful and quiet, I guess, because it is school hours right now. So I'm just going to stroll past much of it. But we will go see the orchard, which is kind of fun because the trees are all marked with signs. It's in signs. With what kind of apples they are. And you can still find those apples in the grocery store here. They're very, very popular. So where can land here at Kristineberg's palace. So, this portion of the program is going to be called A City in Construction. So the big dead-looking tree in front of us is known as the Burl Jarl. Burl Yard. I don't know why that's so hard to say this morning. Burger Jarl Oak. It's around 800 years old, so it's at least as old as Stockholm. And you can see it's right here on the side of these giant over and underpasses. And just behind that is the giant crane building the city, and just beyond that is the giant shopping mall, and then down in the lower corner over there is the pharmaceutical building, which in the center of it is the brewery that we looked at just a little earlier. This is another portion, the edge of the Kristineberg Manor Farm, and many of the familiar signs are these rows of oaks that we're going to talk about more in a little bit. But what I love about this is this roadway, an old clover leaf that we're going to climb up on top of to take a look at, because while the Hornsberg site is completely overrun with manufacturing, residential, and so forth over the last 200 years or so, somehow this one has survived a little bit with some encroachment, but not full encroachment. So who can say? But just above the site, on the, I guess this is the eastern side, is this old interchange, which has been left here, and you can just walk around on it, which, I don't know about you, but I always find it kind of interesting, walking on abandoned roads. Clearly, somebody felt it was important to put this here in the first place, but now it sits here, and grows moss and things like that. So as the city grows over hundreds of years, parts get used, parts don't, and we're here to check them all out, I suppose. So again, back over to the Burger Jarl Oak, and we're going to swing around here, and you can see the low yellow buildings just below is Kristineberg Palace, the school now, and continue on our way up here along the road. And to be honest, I'm just not even sure what this connected to, but there is one small clue in that there's a giant road sign that is the symbol for historical locations and monuments and artifacts painted on the road. And we'll take a look at that before we then go see the orchard in the backside of the palace and get a little bit closer up view. I'm a little camera shy with all the kids around, so we probably won't do much on the front, but we'll make up for that later, maybe with some photos or some other things. But in case, you can see the bustling road at the end And how quiet and lonely this little spot is, eh? Let's see, where is that little sign? Oh, there it is. Just up the way here. So, in the middle of the road, in the middle of these rocks, you can see the little clover leaf looking thing that is the symbol for monuments and so forth. So I imagine someone got off here to try to go see the palace and then could get back on right over there. But I don't know. I haven't seen it on any old maps or anything. It's just here and kind of fun. So we're going to take a scramble down the hill between these residential buildings and go see the orchard. We'll see you there. So you can see in the middle of the frame there's a train signal on the light post, and there goes a train, hopefully. So where that train is, there's a road next to it. That has been there also since about the 1600s. That is the boundary of the Kristineberg site. You can see a bunch of modern residential buildings, and here is an ancient orchard. So these are all fruit trees. As I mentioned earlier, mostly apple and I think some pear. But what I love about it is there's signs on many of them explaining what kind of apple, what kind of pear, and one can readily see those out in grocery stores. Clearly still very popular here in Sweden. And if we stroll by one over here, we'll just get a quick look. It's in Swedish, so if you're really interested, you'll have to translate it yourself later. But you can see here, this tree is labeled this kind, and it's also labeled with the Palace Park dedication. So let's see if we can find the other one that I'm thinking of, because I was able to actually enjoy some of these. They're a little pulpy, if you ask me. I prefer the really crispy kind, a gala, a honey crisp, something like that. But like I said, these others are very popular here. And if I don't get lucky enough to find one, well, I'll just slip in a photo as we go along. Oh, here's another one. This is not the one I was thinking of, but again, all of them are labeled. So let's quickly go over to this other one. Here we go. This is the one. A caro, I think is how you say it. These apples are everywhere. And I guess that's because farms like these for the last 400 years have made them popular. I did do a translation of that particular type. It does say it ripens in December. Clearly not here, but somewhere. And I can imagine why that would have been attractive. In any case, this is the backside of the Kristineberg Palace. I'm sure you can hear the kids still playing, so I'm going to remain respectful and not go do that right now. We'll try to get some other photos and things slipped in here. But this is the whole palace grounds, including this outbuilding, which was built later and is also all part of the school. So what we're going to do now is really quickly wander up across the street over there where you can see the low apartment buildings in the distance, which was also part of the farm. And what I like about it, what's kind of fun, is you can see the mighty oaks, and you can see some of them just right here walking in front of me. And almost always here in Sweden, as you're roaming around some of the palaces, you'll see these rows of oaks. A very important tree for the navies, for royalty and whatnot. There were actually prohibitions for cutting down oak trees throughout Sweden and for much of the history. So you can always tell where the things were because the oaks were still there. Let's go see some. Okay, so here we have the reverse angle going on. Those little buildings now are the Kristineberg Palace. And here are the mighty oaks I was mentioning amongst all of these residential buildings. We have one mighty giant left standing, but can't be living, can it? I don't think so. But among this entire grove, you can see the very telling row of all of these very tall and old trees. And I'll set some photos in later because they stretch all the way down, and I don't think we're going to walk all the way down just in the interest of time. But thank you, Mr. Airplane. On the left, are a bunch of these, and you can tell the land is a little bit lower and a little bit flatter over there, and a little bit higher and a little bit taller on the right. And in the old maps, you can see that those are actually stone pinnacles and peaks, and that has been just now dynamited and built upon, and now it's all residential. But this was originally part of the manor farm. It was described as having a meadow, and this is said meadow, now mixed use. And if I may, in the background, that horizontal bit just under the sun is the road. Again, that was the traditional boundary for the farm. So one last look at our mighty friends, these rows of oaks. Flip around one more time at the reverse angle, and let's head on to our next site.
Not an uncommon sight here, a tour boat. What could they be looking at? Well, in fact, it is the Adolfsberg Villa that was built in 1851 by a famous newspaper editor and owner to just enjoy the waterfront here on Kungsholmen. Interestingly, it used to be over there, but when the bridge was going to be built, they felt the need that it shouldn't be there, and so to avoid destruction in 1951, it was moved over here. And you can just see it right along the footpath. If you're just running along, you just can't miss it. You're looking at the Russian embassy, but before that, it was the Marienburg ammunition factory. Again, a mishmash of industrial and idyllic sites here. We're really only about 500, maybe a kilometer from the Adolfsberg Villa that we just visited. And here, this site used to be a very busy industrial zone, and the pier is still here, as you can see right ahead of us, but now it is a scouting facility. But mostly people just use it, as you can see, for strolling, for running, for walking, for enjoying. And nicely, right around the corner here, as we're going to see shortly, was another idyllic setting. But for the time being, let's just enjoy the sun, shall we? You're looking at the annex. It's really the only building to survive with any history here on the Smedsudden site. Indeed, most recently in history, this was built in 65 to 72 to be a nice park area. And as recently as 1997, these things burned down, including the villa that was originally here, and only the annex, as I said, survived. But here we can see the orchard trees in a nice little row overlooking what is a very beautiful public park and beach. And the area gets its name from the Smedsudden Island, Smedsholmen, which is over here on the left, but is now all land filled in. So you can actually go to what is now more or less a peninsula over there along the waterfront. Funny enough, though, this site has been built up, burned down, built up, and burned down again, and has existed as a farm, an artist colony, and now a cafe, which I highly encourage you to come and enjoy at some point. Back in the 1430s, there used to be a brickworks on this site, but as recently, as 1706, it was turned into a farm site. And while this building doesn't stretch back that far in history, it is currently a personal residence and people live there, so don't go disturb them. But nevertheless, you can see how close this site got to destruction when this bridge was built in the 1930s. And originally, the idea was to, in fact, destroy the farm, but then they realized neither did they have to move it, nor did they have to destroy it. It's just that the residents had to put up with, you can see, the bridge. And that's pretty interesting considering all the other choices that had to be made to connect all of the Stockholm Islands with all these varieties of bridges. But nevertheless, this site used to overlook quite a large farm area, and it was known for its farming and so forth until, again, around the 1930s when it was turned into the park that you can see and enjoy today. Here on the other side of that park, though it used to be farm, is Kongradsberg. And again, I'm sorry for my pronunciation. But as you can see, it's a very palatial looking place. But it is, in fact, Stockholm's first mental hospital. It was originally a farm plot back in the 1770s. But then in 1855 to about 1871, designs and building for this facility were made. And this was really an important transition here in Stockholm to provide for better care for mental health patients. And it's something you still see in sort of Sweden today, this understanding of mental health out there. Let's take a little walk around the facility and just think about how these sites from around 1860s, 1861, were informed by certainly the architecture we've seen elsewhere, stretching back to the 17 and even 1600s. So it's a lovely day. Let's just take a look at the sun, the sky, and what is now a school. Now we're going to go down to the eastern central portion of the island, down near where that N is, just beside it. And here there was a mill built around 1793, and as you can see, it doesn't show up on the 1733 map, but later maps do show it, that little X in the center of the plot. It is no longer there, obviously, today, but there are many other interesting sites that we're going to go and see close up. Come along. Here in the northwest corner of the park, you'll find a little cemetery, which is a little out of place. here just at the end of this street. But it's been here since 1787, when it was originally purchased for use by the Jewish community, and resulted from something of a split in that community at the time. Although the last burial did take place here in 1857, it obviously still exists, and you can visit it on the outside without any appointments or anything else, and you can make special appointments through city offices if you really, really want to for some reason. As we mentioned earlier, there was a mill site here as well, going back to 1793. And that was up on this tall point up here at the top of the park. And obviously for reasons of getting wind, as we've mentioned elsewhere. And fun little fact is that this was one of 4 main mills here on Kungsholmen. And we visited the first one over at Grubbens mill, and this one makes the second one called Kronobergsparken's mill. And that's because this little neighborhood or this little area got the Kronobergsparken name, and in fact this is Kronobergsparken, from a variety of sources. Folks aren't really sure. So apparently it comes from a Kronoberg family, obviously, who first originally had this land. But it's uncertain because the names don't appear on the 1733 map. Some name it to the mill, but that wasn't built until 1793, but the name does appear on that 1733 map. In any case, one of those details, the roots lost in history. The way the park looks today, though, was laid out in 1866 as part of the overall plan of the city. And from here up until, I guess, somewhat recently, it was really seen as one of the best places. In any case, this is where the mill was, right here on the top of this hill. And you can see the little X marks the spot next to the M there, this geographic location. So from the south here, well, actually that's east, you can see those red low buildings right ahead of us, and that area over to that side is a bunch of city buildings, but it's also the end of an old feudal farm, which is where we're going to go to next. So follow along, won't you? You're looking there at Stockholm's police headquarters in the middle of what's called the Red House Park or Rålambshov. And over here is the district court. And these buildings are really only about 100 years old or so, built in the early 1900s through about 1920. But they are built on land that was purchased in 1694 for a feudal farm. You can see it on the 1733 map as we've been looking at it, the one with the big double X on it. And you can see it again when we pull it up in a moment. But what's interesting, of course, is that this whole area, I guess taken over by means of eminent domain or something like we would call it in the U.S., the city needed the land, and so they took it over, built these facilities on top of them, are not just for justice, but also community. So behind the police building, there's, of course, a jail, and also like a building with a swimming pool and gyms and community halls and all the rest. And those stretch right up to the edge of the park we were just standing on. In fact, those low red buildings are the ones that are the end of this building center. In any case, as we walk across the front of the building here on this road, which is the border of where the eastern half of the island used to be. In fact, this farm that we were just talking about and out to the mill where we just were, all were the edge of the developed part, is something we're going to come back to because it was also a center for industry just around the corner from here. But before we go there, let's take a look at the park, which remains a sort of English garden, as it's often called. And here again is the district court that we can take a look at. And literally across the street is Piper Park, Piper Park. And you can see that this is the kind of English garden, as it's sometimes called, the very strictly manicured and maintained pleasure strolling garden with lots of statues and so forth. It's been owned since about 1807, and by a series of orders, they're called. So kind of like the Lions, or kind of like the Rotary Club or something like that, but local things. Here's an image that you can see that's posted actually on the outside as a sign stretching back to the 1700s. And you can see how little it has been changed and how tightly it has been maintained. And it really is just a kind of treat to go and walk by and peer through, although you can't really readily go inside. So again, those double X's, but now we're going to go down the street to a real industrial center that blossomed into, you guessed it, another hospital. So here is what's known as the old Garrison Hospital. It's not a hospital anymore. It's a set of government buildings. You can go there if you have things to take care of. But it was built on the barracks for the Light Dragoons, and later called the Horse Guards, in 1793, and built upon up until about 1911, when this building was built to house the hospital. And it took quite a few years to build. Apparently it was being built from 1816 to 1834. So these buildings, as is often the case, had a core and then built on different wings and extensions and adjustments and so forth. In any case, this location was chosen because it had access to water. But as you can see from the maps that we just looked at in the Google view overhead, there's a lot of landfill that has happened since then, and there's not really any nearness to water anymore. But the orange houses that we're going to explore a little bit more in just a moment were basically alongside the water not that long ago, and that was important to them for their leather business. Before we go down there and take a look at those buildings and houses, just please do consider that this hospital was used up until around 1952, when it was considered part of St. George's or St. Goran's Hospital, which is a major hospital up on the hill here in Kungsholmen. But we haven't gone to go visit because there's not that many historical buildings there. And so you have to use a whole lot of imagination, which we're already sort of using a lot of. So we're going to stick to sites that we can at least see something that's old and interesting and connected to the depth of history here in the location. So as I was saying, as we walk down here, you can see the waterfront there. You can see these orange houses. More or less where those orange houses were or are is where the water was. And it was full of docks and wharves and people coming and going in a very industrial setting. And what were they doing over here? They were making leather. So there was quite a famous tannery section right here. And this house that we're looking at was built for the Graver family by Jacob Graver. As you can see, conveniently labeled 1754, so quite an old building. He founded his tannery with two other folks, Mr. Jennings and Mr. Finley. And most of these buildings on the left and the right, you can see, were used for making the leather and doing the tannery work. But the 1754 labeled building actually was his home, and it was habitable in 1755, and they had a household of apparently 18 people, so pretty darn big for 18 people. But I'm sure that was very convenient, and very little commute time to your work, I'm sure. So what's interesting is this little area is also established as early as 1640 as part of a city plan, and many tanners did settle in this area to do their work and live. And with easy access to water, one can readily imagine it. As an industrial center, it really did attract other businesses. And peering through the cracks there, you can see that bright red brick building kind of low on the horizon, as it were. And that itself was an exciting place that we're going to go to next, right around the corner. This street we're looking at was originally designed as a turnaround for wagons, carts, cars, trucks, etc., to help serve the industrial area that it was. This building here, as we mentioned a minute ago, was the St. Eric's Brewery. It was built in the early 1800s, and in 1870 put out a beer called St. Eric's. It was so popular they decided to name the whole brewery after that. As you can see, the street at the time was not the idyllic park setting that you see today and we all enjoy, flanked by residential buildings and housing and even grocery stores and so forth. Instead, this was an out-of-the-way industrial area, which, as we saw from the earlier balloon aerial photography, off to the west was just open land and very, very empty. So this was kind of the edge of the city. And a good thing, too, because the tannery business, which is, again, just on the other side of the buildings on the left, was pretty stinky and needed lots of water, needed lots of space. Now, of course, that's all gone, but it was here up until the 1920s, so the city has really transformed quite a bit in just even the last 100 years. Getting back to the beer making, though, the brewery's success can partly be attributed to the businessman Mr. Smith, who had been the dominant owner since 1860 and remained even on the board all the way until 1904. And during the end of the 19th century, that is to say in the late 1800s, the St. Eric's Brewery was the largest in Stockholm, and they took their water straight out of the waterway we just saw there with basically a 400 foot or 237 meter pipeline that was just sucking the water out of there. So it tells you a lot about the water quality and so forth. Although inside the building itself, they had lots of other facilities for washing, cleaning, drying, malting, etc. Again, this just helps you out. There's the Garrison Hospital. Now we go up the street and we're going to make our way over towards the very end, the eastern end of the city. And by way of orientation, straight ahead there, we've made kind of a little small loop, is where the Piper Garden is and where the district court was. And if you really know what you're looking for, you can find a secret statue. It's hidden in plain sight and just right up here at the end of the way. Kitty! Now we're going to make our way right down the street to Kungsholmen Church, which was established in 1671, but it was held, services were held just in a small wooden building. In 1672, an architect proposed the building, or akin to the building that you can see today. And after the king donated quite a bit of funding, it was started in 1673. And then, due to complications, as do happen in many times in this kind of building, it was put off for about 10 years. And then it was picked up in 1685. And finally, the church was inaugurated by the Archbishop for Sweden in 1688. And there's a giant plaque at the end that we'll go see just around the corner here. But in the meantime, we can see that other buildings, a similar poorhouse that we saw earlier, these sort of orange barn-style buildings that were provided for orphans, widows, unemployed, sick, infirm, and so forth, to give them some kind of means of support. Along the walls over here, you can see many different, very old tombs and other kinds of crypts, and these belong to, of course, very famous folks who were contributors to the church early on, back in the 1600s or so. And you can see as we round the building here where these plaques are, and we'll also give you a sense of sort of what the church looked like back when it was 1655 to 1727 or so. As I said, here is the famous big memorial plaque. You can see the dates and the other memorials to having the church built. All easily accessible, just right around the back. You just don't get creeped out by the graveyard, which is also here, as you can see. A cool thing about it is you see the little fenced off area. That is not for naughty graves. There's no undead in there. But instead, the cultural departments here do from time to time come through and renovate, update, clean, and otherwise protect the site, which is pretty darn cool when you think about it. Next, though, we're going to go again across the street. So if money is the root of all evil, it was close by anyway. Right down there where that other barn is, as you can see in the distance, is the Royal Mint. So let's take a stroll over towards there, shall we? So here we are at the Royal Mint, nicely labeled as we walk through the main archway here. It's situated on the eastern side of Kungsholmen Island, really right across the street and around the corner from the town hall. Real easy to come see, open to the public, as you can see, but you have to use your imagination. The industrial heritage here goes back to the 1680s, when this was originally a manor farm and then became a blacksmith's forge, had textile printing works and dye works up through the 18th century, the late 1700s that is. And then in the early 19th century, the father of Swedish mechanical industry, another one of those geniuses, Samuel Owen, he established his mechanical workshop in this block. But then that block was taken over in 1847 by the Royal Mint and Inspection Works, and so the manor was adopted for industrial and official entertainment and residential purposes. The old wooden sheds were demolished, existing stone buildings were renovated, and a modern new workshop was constructed. So basically that barn building we just saw, as we've touched on several times. There behind us you can see the Kungsholmen Church. But back to the mint here, the coins were forged by the mint in the workshop here at the manor. And it was defended by the surrounding buildings, which of course was very important because they were storing lots of gold and silver and copper for all of those coins to be completed. And so you can still see traces of these things in these guard houses and walls, which date back to that period. And anyone who has seen any of the videos I've made will recognize the gun slits. They're made for nicely defending the interior against the exterior. Hopefully by now it's not too strange that I'm standing in the middle of a parking lot and you've gotten used to using your imagination a bit. What I'm standing on back in history would have been water. In fact, I would have been, up to, who knows, right about here, I'd say, in water. And what was next to me here was an island. The landfill for this started in the 1680s as part of the 1640 city plan and welcomed the glassblowing industries from Södermalm, the island to the south, here to Kungsholmen. But what we're looking at are buildings that were put together in 1870 for the Karolinska Institute, the famous educational school here in town. And by that period, most of the land had just all been filled in, and this was barely a peninsula today. In fact, it's many meters from the water. But it still maintains a connection to the Karolinska Institute. When the PhDs get their caps at the City Hall right next door, they get quite the famous salute. That's a fun thing to hear as you're coming along running and all of a sudden you hear cannon fire. But it is a really cool connection from its original housing here in these buildings to the city's life today. And so all of these buildings around us here were part of the industrial and educational heritage here in Stockholm. But we're going to wrap up our tour across the street. Here we have the reverse angle. That's the Karolinska buildings we were just looking at, and here is the City Hall, where many tourists stop. Across the street is this nondescript white building, white archway that reads Royal Hospital. And I highly recommend coming over and take a look because under your feet is a Ore feudal nobility farm that stretches back to the 1600s. In fact, it was granted in 1674, the year after the recently raised Grubbensparken became a baron. Since then, though, it became a hospital known as the Seraphim Knights Hospital. In fact, if you look carefully on that building there in the corner, that is it. But before we go there, we will notice that this sign here says 1792, although the gate was moved here into this position in 1928. Nevertheless, these are artifacts that remain of the farm, of the hospital, and of the location, which you can readily just hop across the street and take a look at. It's well worth a walk through the park. And as you do walk around the park, you might enjoy knowing that the white building here is where the original manor house was, and is portions of that building do exist today. But for the most part, it was taken over in the 1750s and set up as a hospital after the Crown purchased the land and the former farm to build a research and surgical hospital on the site. And from then, it was really seen as the Royal Seraphim Hospital and was linked to the Karolinska Institute and had been really part of their whole operation and education facility since 1910. It was used up until the 1970s, and among the famous things were like the first kidney transplant happened here in Sweden in 1964. The buildings, though, today are not part of that hospital. They've been moved off to much more modern facilities, but it's really fun to walk around and take a look. You can get a sense of the history and, as I've said many times, the connection to all the things underfoot. In fact, we're going to wrap up our tour here just where we began it on the other side of this administrative building. And I offer you a small glimpse into the past, which is a copper engraving that was made from the original Ore Manor. And you can see the church buildings and the palace and other facilities from this location from today. So stretching from here and now way back to the 1700s. Sure hope you've enjoyed the tour. Hope you come back for another time. It's in the Signs. We'll see ya.